Now, in other news, China is relaxing COVID restrictions in some major cities following days of public protests calling for a lifting of lockdown measures. The country's vice premier also hinted at a further loosening of restrictions after announcing that the country was facing a new situation. In parts of Guangzhou and the south, people identified as close contacts of positive cases are being allowed to quarantine at their homes rather than in centralized facilities. Similar changes have also been seen in the capital, Beijing. China's zero COVID policy has led to unprecedented demonstrations in recent days. And our ICE chief correspondent John Cookson joins us now from London, where he's been monitoring developments. Good to see you, John. This definitely marks a change of tone from the Chinese authorities, doesn't it? Tell us more about their new pandemic strategy and which restrictions are being lifted.
Hey, Charles, good to see you. Well, look, this zero policy towards COVID is absolutely on the brink of collapse. President Xi has been trying to enforce it now for the last 3 years, but the people are just fed up. And you saw in those footage just shown that things are easing up, and this is a direct result of protests that started, in fact, just a week ago now, when there was that terrible fire at an apartment block in Urumqi in the west of China last Thursday, which led to demonstrations, unprecedented demonstrations, as you say, Charles, on the streets. I know China fairly well. I used to live in Hong Kong and work there as a journalist. I used to travel into China quite often. And back then, and I'm talking about the 1990s, Charles, the government had a contract with the people, and that contract was, in response of you giving us absolute power, that's to the government, we'll take care of you. And the Chinese people were happy with that. But now in 2019 and onwards, the Chinese people have fallen victim to this terrible disease. In other words, the government hasn't looked after the Chinese people as they were bound to under this contract. And that's what's changing here. That it's moving from a health crisis to a possible political crisis for the leadership in Beijing. Now, we're not dealing with a transparent government here. We don't know exactly what's going on in the corridors of power. But President Xi must have come under a lot of pressure from the elite, from the head of the military, and they must have said to him, look, you've got to ease up on these COVID restrictions, and there has been some limited easing. You mentioned a few of them earlier. For example, people not having to go into isolation, not go into isolation for a long period, to be able to isolate at home. So the government is moving. There's a shifting of the tectonic plates. Now, how far this is going to go, we'll have to wait and see. Because only yesterday we were reporting on unrest in Guangzhou, otherwise known as Canton, in the south of China. So this has not gone away, and these are critical days for President Xi.
Well, I mean, you mentioned limited easing, John. I mean, that's really the critical question, isn't it? Is this likely to be enough to end the protests, or could it even encourage more protests as people see relaxation elsewhere and want some of that for themselves and their region? Because, I mean, the restrictions, as you said, haven't been lifted in a national sense, has it?
No, not at all. It's almost been done on a city by city case. And you mentioned Beijing, Shanghai also has seen easing of COVID restrictions. But there is more to this, as we've discussed earlier in the week, Charles, than COVID. There are political tensions in China to do with unemployment and the general economic situation for ordinary Chinese people, and how the elite in China, they're also being included in these lockdowns, and they don't like it. And so at many levels, there are tensions bubbling away in China right now.
And John, really, I mean, let's face it, that COVID framework, from what you're describing, is very much actually staying in place. So even though the authorities appear to be dialing back some of the restrictions, they're certainly not dialing back their ability to impose restrictions, are they? I mean, they're just loosening the restrictions and, as it were, loosening the noose.
Yeah, and they say I can compare this with Iran, with the unrest that happens there from time to time, and very recently there. What the government does is it sees it has a pressure cooker situation, and it loosens a tap to let some of the steam out from time to time, and things settle down. It's early days to see where this is going, Charles, but. You know, these are days when people have access to the internet and social media. They can get around various restrictions in China, and they can see the restrictions will be totally eased in Japan, in South Korea, and other neighboring countries to China. And the people just want the same. That said, and I'll just go back to my own experience in the region, a city like Guangzhou with millions of people, if COVID takes a hold there, I don't know how they're going to control it, because the streets are terribly narrow. People are packed tightly into apartment blocks. I mean, the potential for an explosion of COVID in a city like Guangzhou is absolutely enormous. And that would, of course, apply to many other industrial cities in China. So, as I say, tricky times for the leadership.
And John, the benefit of your vast experience helps us understand these things. John Cookson, Arise chief correspondent, talking to me there about the lifting of or easing of some of the COVID restrictions